What up, Wizards? It's Dev from the place. Another week, a fresh batch of delicious smelling Edge of Eternities previews right out of the oven. Those are some good looking cookies, baby. Time to let them cool. Let's get them on a plate. I acknowledge the cookie analogy has gone too far, so let's look at some cards. Let's start with some bomb comms. That's bomb commons. We got to see 4 of these today, and I guess only half of them are actually good. So with that said, let's look at Radiant Strike and Lux Knight Breacher first. Now, Radiant Strike is 4 mana, 3 and a white for an instant. Destroy an artifact or tap creature and gain 3 life. 4 mana is probably a little bit too much for this, but you'll play it in limited for sure. It's a halfway decent removal spell there. Lux Knight Breacher is 4 mana, 3 and a white for a 2/2 human knight. It enters with a +1/+1 counter on it for each other creature and or artifact that you control. So again, in limited, this could get pretty big. And I guess in standard, it could get pretty big too. But like, even if it's a 4 mana 6/6, it's just kind of a vanilla guy beyond that. So I'm just not like too confident in its standard performance. But again, I guess in limited, where we have all these lander tokens and other little artifacts kind of hanging around, all your spacecraft and whatnot, and a couple of other creatures on the table, like Sure, play like a 7/7 on turn 6. It'd probably work out well for you. But the 2 better commons that we saw today, for sure, were Melded Moxite and Cryogen Relic. Now, Melded Moxite is 2 mana, 1 on a red for an artifact. When it enters, you may discard a card. If you do, draw 2 cards. You can also pay 3 mana and sack it to get a tapped 2/2 robot artifact creature token. This is not half bad, We've seen enchantments like Bitter Reunion see some play because they're enchantments. You can sacrifice them to various effects, or you just get some value from having an enchantment or just a permanent on the table. So we get kind of one of these tormenting voice effects, but it's on an artifact. And again, that could be like really relevant. You can sack artifacts to even more effects than you can sack enchantments, right? But it's also nice to just have an artifact on the table for a bunch of different synergies and standard, coming up. So kind of like that. And eventually it converts into a 2/2. Like, sure, it's instant speed, the activation. Sure, it creates a tap, dude. You can't block with it. But just like EOT make a 2/2, like, sure, some of the time at least. And we've already seen that the enter the battlefield trigger that it has can be a good effect if you're trying to bin cards and draw some fresh ones. So honestly, I kind of like a lot about this. I'm surprised it's not an uncommon in some ways. The only problem with the card is that they had the stones to put Moxite in the name, but like, has nothing to do with the Moxin or anything. Doesn't make mana. It's just kind of, why'd you do that? Anyway, Cryogen Relic is the other comment on screen here, and I think it's pretty good too, man. 2 mana, 1 on a blue for an artifact. When it enters or leaves the battlefield, draw a card. That's doesn't have to have any other text. Like, that's just kind of fine. But it's also got 1 on a blue and sack it to put a stun counter on up to 1 target tapped creature. So the thing that you're putting the stun counter on already has to be tapped. But again, I like an instant speed activation. If opponent comes in with a guy, you can just put a stun counter on it. You're not attacking with it the next turn. That's okay. But just, enters or leaves, draw the card, and you have to sack it for its own abilities. So it's kind of 4 mana, get an artifact for now and draw a card later. Just the full investment is 4 mana. And I actually don't think that's a bad deal, especially considering you get the second card at instant speed, while you also get like a form of tempo, a little bit of removal here and there, never hurt anybody. So I actually kind of like this, just like Melded Moxite. It's an artifact on turn 2, and there's a lot of reasons why you might want one of those. You can sack it to anything else. It doesn't have to sack to its own ability. If you sack it to something else, you still draw the card, like an Ichor Wellspring or something. So that's proven to be a pretty silly effect at certain points in the past. So I don't know, man. Kind of like this a good bit. And just one more thing. I guess if you blink it and it comes right back, you get to draw like 2 cards immediately. So that seems like a pretty good deal too. So a lot of stuff about this that's cool as well. I guess one more thing about this is if we're still playing Pixie, like even after the bans, and I've seen some people trying it out, like this is pretty good to snap back to your hand and play again. You're drawing like a lot of cards that way. So this could actually be like a stunner, like just watch out for this one is all I'm saying. But that said, let's move on to the uncommons. The first couple, at least of which, are not as good as this card. All that said, we got to look at Atmospheric Greenhouse. We just got to. And also, Close Encounter as well. Now, Greenhouse is 5 mana, 4 and a green for a 5/4 spacecraft. When it enters, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature that you control. And once you've stationed this 8+, it becomes a creature, and it has Flample. So, a 5 mana, 5/4 Flample. But, it takes a while to station this, I think, but I guess it helps you station it because it puts a bunch of counters on your guys. That makes them station anything pretty nicely, even if you only had like 2 or 3 guys when you played this. Again, this is one of those where in limited, if you have a high enough creature count, maybe we can start talking. If you care about +1/+1 counters enough, maybe we can start talking. But usually, 5-6 mana is what you pay for sort of the overrun effect in a set. And I'm not saying this is the overrun effect, but it is kind of an overrun effect in some ways in limited. So this card actually does a little bit more than it looks like, but only really in the limited environment. So I should at least point it out. But next we'll look at what I think is like sneakily a pretty good card. This is Close Encounter, which already looks decent enough, but once you know how it truly works, it's much better than the average green fighter bite spell. Now this is 2 mana, 1 on a green for an instant. As an additional cost to cast this spell, choose a creature you control or a warped creature card you own in exile. Close Encounter deals damage equal to the power of the chosen creature or card to target creature. Now, the cool thing about this is that usually with a bite or a fight spell, you'll target one of your guys, and then your opponent can just blow it away with a removal spell while the bite spell's on the stack, and then you don't get your bite spell anymore because the creature's gone. This doesn't work that way. Even if you choose a creature in play, if they remove your guy while this spell's on the stack, it'll still deal the damage to a creature they control, which is really, really cool. I guess the downside on that is that you don't get, like, let's say your creature has Death Touch, right? That's a use case for bite spells we see a lot, is that we have little guys with Death Touch and we want to use bite spells as just unconditional removal. Well, this card doesn't do that because this card is dealing damage to the other creature, not your creature. So again, there's some tension on this one compared to how bite and fight spells normally work, but I think being able to just fire it off and not have to worry about whether your creature gets removed is really sick at instant speed. It's also a bite effect instead of fight, which I guess it didn't necessarily have to be, but I guess the way they worded it, it sort of does. And it gives warped creatures something to do while they're in exile, because there's a lot of really cheap warp costs for relatively expensive creatures. So there's going to be, 3-4 turns in between you warping it and you actually playing it a lot of the time. So this is great in those instances, especially given how many relatively big creatures have really cheap warp costs. So you warp something on turn 2 that's like 4 or 5 power, or maybe even more. There's that 9/9 that warps for 3 mana. So starting on turn 4, you can basically kill any creature in the environment, which I think is really sick. I think this might actually go beyond limited just because of the way it's worded. If a mono green deck doesn't care about Death Touch or anything like that, and it just wants a solid removal spell, I think this is not necessarily top of the list, but pretty close. But let's move on to some, I guess, slightly more normal uncommons. We got to see another removal spell, Cut Propulsion, and I think some people are kind of excited about this one. But alongside that, we also saw Hilderblade. I think you're supposed to pronounce it that way. But anyway, Cut Propulsion is 3 mana, 2 and a red for an instant. Target creature deals damage to itself equal to its power. If that creature has flying, it deals twice that much damage to itself instead. So that's kind of cute. I guess you could target your own Screaming Nemesis with this if you just absolutely had to have it deal damage to something right then and there. And it is instant speed, so I guess you could stack it on top of a removal spell or something. If you're going to lose your Nemesis anyway, who cares? But this is kind of nice as a mono red removal spell against large-ish creatures, especially large creatures with flying, because you basically kill every flying creature. Not ever printed. You don't kill Ornithopter with this, notably, but still, there's a lot of really important big flying threats. This just cuts down immediately. So that's kind of nice, I guess. It's like a sideboard red removal spell. We've seen them use Witchstalker Frenzy and stuff in the past, but I just don't think anything's really going to take them off Twin Maw Stormbrood, especially if there aren't any, huge threats in the format they really have to worry about. And 5 toughness is kind of where everything stops. So, I'm not really sure. Maybe the instant speed wins out over Stormbrood sorcery speed or something, but again, can't be sure about it at the end of the day. But it wouldn't surprise me if some people slotted a copy of this into the sideboard at the beginning of the season to see if it works. Now, Hilderblade over here is a 1 mana equipment. It only costs 1 black, and it costs 4 to equip, but more on that in a second. Equipped creature gets +3/+1. It also has Void. At the beginning of your end step, if a non-land permanent left the battlefield this turn or a spell was warped this turn, attach this permanent to target creature you control. It's actually pretty good, man. It's not amazing or anything, and I'm not going to say it's the same thing as Dark Knight's Sword or whatever. I kind of flipped over about that card last preview season, and I even played it in my Cecil deck. I thought it was pretty decent there. It's not that bad, but this is technically worse, I think, a lot of the time than Dark Knight's Blade, so I don't expect this to see too much play, but it is at least interesting, a single black mana and probably a free equip most of the time for a relatively large power toughness boost, it says equip 4, and I think sometimes you'll pay that if you have nothing else better to do, but, for the most part, a removal spell or a weird combat step, and suddenly you can play this second main phase and get it equipped to something the same turn, and I think that's okay. But next, let's take a look at Lightless Evangel and Honored Knight Captain. Evangel is 2 mana, 1 and a black for a 2/2 Vampire Cleric. Nice creature types. Whenever you sacrifice another creature or artifact, put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. So not quite Bartolome del Presidio, but, it gets larger when you sack stuff. I have ceased to be very impressed by this stuff since I was kind of burned by a card like many sets ago, but not that many sets ago, Gixian something or other, that's supposed to get larger whenever you sack a thing, and that card never really did anything. Even in my own Aristocrats builds, I just couldn't really get it to pop off, so I also don't trust this as much, but I guess in games of Commander or something, a format I have not yet brought up this video, you should be proud of me, but anyway, I guess in Commander where you are doing like semi or even completely infinite, like Phyrexian Altar or Ashnod's Altar combos with creatures you just get right back from the graveyard. This could get infinitely large, and I guess that's worthy of note, but usually you're getting like death triggers from Blood Artist type creatures and stuff, and you're just finishing the game off anyway that way, so you don't need a creature that gets huge, and there's already a couple of dudes that are kind of like this guy anyway that have never really made any noise whatsoever, so again, as much as a guy like me should be excited by a creature like this, I'm not as much anymore, but I guess in Limited, where there are some pretty developed sacrifice, strategies in this environment, not just straight up aristocrats, but heck, we've seen in this video 2 artifacts you can sacrifice that'll trigger this, so it might be able to get relatively large. There's lander tokens in the environment, so that could work, I guess. It's just not the most embarrassing dude anyway as a 2-mana 2/2. We like to call that a 23rd card, or 16th creature, not the first thing you choose, but maybe not something that always gets cut either, so I have some respect for it in Limited, but I would also say that unless you have some pretty well-developed sacrifice synergies in your pre-release deck, you probably should cut the guy, but all things considered, I'm supposed to like dudes like this. Don't like him as much as I used to. But Honored Knight Captain, this looks alright, man. 2 mana, 1 and a white for a 1/1 Human Advisor Knight. When this creature enters, create a 1/1 white human soldier creature token. You can also pay 6 mana if you feel like it, 4, 2 white, and sacrifice this creature. Telling you, a lot of sacrifice stuff. Search your library for an equipment card, put it onto the battlefield, and then shuffle up. So I have seen a couple people on Reddit today say like, hey, Boros equipments, right? I don't really think so necessarily. That deck already has a bunch of stacked 2-drops that it wants to play, and the way its curve is, it honestly doesn't have that much room for 2-drop creatures, beyond the 8 that it already plays. So I'm not sure that this ends up going in there. You've got, job select equipment that you'd probably rather have. I've seen people play Dragoon's Lance and the Resolute Reinforcements like Imidane's Recruiter deck, right? So I'm just not sure that this is the kind of 2-drop that most decks want, especially considering they have, a flash 2-drop that already kind of does this. It doesn't have a 6-drop activated ability on it, but it's usually better because it has flash, and that card doesn't even see as much play as it probably should. So just because this guy gives you a couple of bodies for 2 mana doesn't necessarily make him great. It makes him better than a lot of uncommons. Don't get me wrong, but I think some people are seeing the activated ability and being like, ooh, and like, it's, hey, dream your dreams, you know what I'm saying? I'm not here to stop you doing that, but least of all me. I don't want to do that, but at the same time, 6 mana is pretty steep, and it doesn't even guarantee that you get to equip the equipment the same turn or anything like that, but I guess throwing it onto the battlefield is pretty strong, depending on what you're going to get, so maybe a one of an equipment. I'm coming around on it, but I just think you probably, by and large, have better options. That said, in Commander, hate to say the C word, but, in Commander, maybe your equipment's deck can fit this a little more easily, and it can use the activated ability a little bit more easily, because, you actually get to the turn where you're able to do that. So, possibly there, but I'm not really seeing it in Standard as much as I do like a guy that gives you a couple of bodies at such an efficient cost. Now, my favorite uncommon of the day, I'm going to go ahead and warn you, is probably nothing special, and the best uncommon of the day was probably that green removal spell that we looked at, but there's just something about Dauntless Scrapbot that I really like. 3 mana for a 3/1 artifact robot. When this creature enters, exile each opponent's graveyard. Create a lander token. That's the whole text on the card, man. I think this is actually pretty all right. Like on turn 3, it exiles the Reanimator deck's graveyard before they can really do any reanimating. It exiles the Omniscience deck's graveyard before they can really do too much with it. It's a key turn to be exiling graveyards, turn 3. Any deck can play this, right? It's a 3-1, so I guess it can trade in combat pretty easily, and by then, it's already done everything you want it to do anyway, right? Like, its ETB triggers are kind of incredible when you think about it. Like, it basically has 2 ETB triggers, and one of them is Ramp, that puts a second artifact onto the table, and that might be a big deal depending on what deck you're playing. So, this triggers Simulacrum Synthesizer, so at the very least, it might be a sideboard piece in the Synthesizer decks when it does come up against Omniscience, Reanimator, and Insidious Roots, whatever it is, right? So it's good there. It also puts like not a sizable body on the table, but again, like this blocks relatively well and trades okay, and can even get in some offense if the opponent doesn't have a whole lot going on over there. So I don't know, man. I think this is actually a pretty solid uncommon that at the very least could see some sideboard play over the next few months or even, the next year or two. Who knows? I just think it's a better card than it looks like. And the ramp is very welcome. Again, it's not like Solemn Simulacrum or anything, but like it ain't bad, I'm telling you. But let's get to these rares, man. Some pretty good ones today, which I guess you can tell if I have to start with cards like Lumen Class Frigate here. This is solid right here, man. 2 mana, 1 and a white for a 3/5 spacecraft with station. At 2+ station, other creatures you control get +1/+1. And at 12+ station, it has flying and lifelink, and it can attack and block and stuff. So 12+ is so much. I would not even worry about attacking with this card. It's basically a 2 mana Anthem effect for anything, but it probably takes you off of the attack step the turn that you play it. That said, if you play any Savannah Lions, and there's like a million of them in Standard at this point, any 1 mana 2-power creature, you drop this on turn 2, and you skip your attack step, which sucks, but like you're still getting a 2 mana Anthem effect that's like reasonably harder to remove than a creature or even an enchantment might be. So I think this is okay as a 2 mana Anthem. The trade-off for any deck being able to play it is that, you're going to have to come down on your speed just a little bit and then get like burst turns later on in the game. So I do worry about playing a 1 mana 2/1 every time on turn 1 for sure. You have to do that. Turn 2, not only do you not get another creature, but you don't get to attack with your aggressive lion. And then on turn 3, you still haven't actually attacked in your aggressive deck. So I do think there's some like, kind of awkward things about this card. But that said, you could always drop it on turn 4. And now, since your Savannah Lions can't really attack into what they've got going on anyway, you can now turn that Savannah Lions into, the activation you need to make all your other creatures larger. So, this does have some sort of, I guess, theory crafting that you have to do to play it in an aggro deck. And later in the game, sure, it can be a 3/5 flying lifelink, I guess. But for the most part, you're trying to figure out how to work in a 2 mana Anthem effect, and I think there's probably ways of doing it. The card doesn't look too shabby. But next, let's look at one for the Commander, boys and ladies. It's Loading Zone, 4 mana, 3 and a green for an enchantment. If one or more counters would be put on a creature, spacecraft, or planet you control, twice that many of each of those kinds of counters are put on it instead, and you can warp this for a single green mana. Speaking of burst turns, again, man, you can probably create some real value just by warping this in a game of Commander and then doing all your wild counters stuff. And it doesn't even have to be +1/+1 counters. They were very careful with this, and it doesn't affect Planeswalkers, which is kind of sad depending on what you want to do. But just warping it into play and then activating 2 Planeswalkers would probably be pretty wild, getting extra counters on them or whatever. But either way, just having it affect creatures and then a couple of other ancillary types. You might not have a lot of spacecraft in your Commander deck, and you probably won't have too many planets either. Those are all the mythic lands that are meant to like ape other lands, like the Gaia's Cradle one and Tolarian Academy one. Like those are planets, right? So maybe in Standard, there's a way, I'm going to go to Standard for a second, there's a way to warp this in and then suddenly get a billion counters on your stuff, on your planets, and now you actually do have a Gaia's Cradle or something, like maybe you do it that way. But ultimately, I think this looks more like a Commander card, and I hope I don't eat those words, because again, 1 green mana to warp this effect in and basically cast it as a sorcery, let's just say, is probably really good. And remember that it's an enchantment, it's not like it goes straight to exile or whatever. Like, it is an enchantment that comes into play and gets you all your enchantress effects and stuff like that too. Maybe some of those enchantress effects put +1/+1 counters on things, right? You got like a generous visitor sitting around somewhere. You pulled from the Kamigawa set, like, oh no, it's still legal in standard. I promise it's not. Don't try it. Either way, yeah, I think this could like maybe have some potential in standard again because it's such a low cost to warp it out, and you might be able to get a ton of value, enough to where you're actually kind of burying your opponent at that point. So I really don't put this past seeing play in standard if the right deck exists. Note that, say, you can warp this into play in the sort of current Tifa Mossborn Hydra deck that exists in standard, has been doing so well on MTGO this week. Like, as I record, that deck has been slamming MTGO like hard. So, with not Tifa, but Mossborn especially, that's +1/+1 counters right there. You could get him real big, real fast, and it technically only costs you a mana. So again, this might have practical uses there, but I especially think in Commander, this is going to have quite the life ahead of it. People love effects like this. In Commander, it's not like there aren't already a few, and they all mostly see play in the +1/+1 counters decks. And this one, I could see people like really salivating over. So go ahead and kind of start brewing with it now. It is pretty powerful, I think, at least. But it's time for my favorite rare of the day on a personal level. This is definitely not the best one, but you probably know which one it is if you've ever seen my content. It's the Orzhov legend. What a surprise. Here's Servandum Sunstar Exemplar. I like the bar there. And I like that you can create further bars by saying bars after you say its name. But anyway, this is just 2 mana, white and a black, for a 2/2 legendary human knight with both vigilance and menace. So, okay, whenever another creature you control dies or is put into exile, put a +1/+1 counter on Servandum and you gain a life. When Servandum dies or is put into exile while its power is 4 or greater, destroy up to 1 target non-land permanent. For one, I kind of like the sneaky play on this, to where if your opponent targets it with a removal spell while it's still small, you can just hit it with a pump spell. Like, gotcha! Like, hit it with a pump spell on its way out, and it gets to blow something up. But, blowing up a non-land permanent almost guaranteed once it's at, a certain power is pretty wild. It's like the best part of the card, and the card is already fairly aggressively costed, It's got knight stats. I like that it is a knight, and it is a knight, right? It's a 2 mana 2/2 with a couple of keyword abilities. That's some serious knight stuff from the old days of Magic. And honestly, just a 2 mana 2/2 vigilance menace, it's not the best thing I've ever seen, but like, that's all right. That's fine. So I like that. The problem is, to get its power like relatively large, other stuff has to die or get put into exile. A couple things I like about the way this is worded is that if you blink your own creatures, then suddenly they were put into exile, right? So this guy gets a +1/+1 counter, you gain a life, all your life gain triggers go off, and your Johnny's Pride mates get larger, your Amalia gets larger. That seems fine. But also, your Starscape Cleric goes off, or whatever he's called. That seems okay, But also, you can blink this guy. Like, once his power is 4 or greater, sure, he'll come back and be reset. You'll have to start over and get more counters. But I just kind of like the idea of, let's say your opponent targets him with a removal spell when his power is at 4. They know they're going to lose a thing anyway, right? So they go ahead and get him off the table. You blink him, right? So now you get to blow up a non-land permanent, your opponent's removal spell fizzles, and you get your Servandum back. And that seems okay, man. It really does. It's just, usually these death triggers are nerfed by exile effects, and this one is not, and I really think that's sick. So, we're getting into the good stuff today, and usually I think that I'm judging these Orzhov legends a little too leniently because I'm an Orzhov guy, and I like, life gain triggers, and I like knights, and I like Orzhov legends, and I'm just, I'm the Orzhov dude around here. I like blowing up non-land permanents. Like, everything the card does, I like, but it's also worth noting that at least like 2 out of 3 things the card does are actually objectively good and not just a thing that I like. So, this has to fight through a bunch of other like 2-drops to actually end up seeing play, but it works in Raise the Past. It can get raised. It kind of works in the Zorline deck because it gains life and you want to be able to bring it back once it does die so you can use its abilities again. So any Aristocrats deck, like a Sephiroth deck or something, this is going to benefit from your creatures dying, obviously, and then you can sack it to something else once its power is large enough, and bing bang, blow up an on-land permanent, just reanimate it with Helping Hand or something, and start over. So there's a lot this can actually do. I'm just not sure it's going to get a real chance to do any of that because you have to understand how how powerful cards are in Standard, even after the bans, even after rotation. Is this something we really play? I'm not too sure, but again, we've discussed a bunch of tricks with it already. Pump spells are just one, right? So I don't know. I could see this actually, doing a thing in Standard, which I'd be pretty happy with until I'm a little bit annoyed by it. Now, next we have a card that I really don't know what to make of, but I also don't want to call bad. I really don't want to call it bad because it might be really, really good. This is Synthesizer Lab Ship. A single blue mana for a 4/4 spacecraft with station. Once it's stationed at least 2, at the beginning of combat on your turn, up to 1 other target artifact you control becomes an artifact creature with base power and toughness 2/2 and gains flying until end of turn. And at 9+, this can attack and block. It's a creature and it has flying and vigilance. So 9+ is so much that I don't even really care. I'm not going to look at that so much or judge it on that. I'm mostly judging this as a 1 mana artifact that turns your artifacts into 2/2s that fly for a single turn. If you go, say, Synthesizer Lab Ship on, you want to go Spyglass Siren or whatever it's called. On turn 1 and get your map token, that little 1/1 flyer. And then on turn 2, I guess what you want to do is pop the map token. Well, that doesn't work either. I don't know what you do, how you actually, get the real value with this on turn 2, like how you station it on turn 2 in that deck. But, I guess there are probably ways of doing it. I think that it all starts with Spyglass Siren. Either way, man. In the artifact-based blue-white deck, which there already is one that isn't necessarily Simulacrum Synthesizer, there's a sort of Zoetic Glyphy deck that I'm not even sure is still going to be available, but either way, there is a small ball, blue-white artifact deck that might be able to leverage this. It's got like Case of the Filched Falcon in it and stuff like that. A lot of really, really low to the ground artifact making effects that this could be good with, but you have to, station it at least 2 relatively early in the game. That said, if you do, then you probably got a 2/2 flyer like every turn of the game. So this wants to be a 1 mana 2/2 flyer, but it kind of isn't. I do wish that it just turned an artifact into a 2/2 flyer forever, every turn, but that might be a little too much. You know what I'm saying? That might actually be good. This, as it's currently written, I think is probably more on the, not great side of things, I think. But again, this is one of those where it's pretty easy to misjudge it, I think, on first read or first look, and then you play against it, and it turns out that, your opponent does have a 2/2 flyer every turn of the game, even if you blow up their 2/2 flyer, right? You got to take this out. So I also am not necessarily scared of it or anything. It's just one of those where you look at it and you think, okay, so like Corey Stillcutter, that made a monk more or less every turn. Even if you kill the monk, you still have to worry about them having another monk on the next turn. And this is kind of that for only 1 mana. Like, it doesn't have prowess, but the monk didn't have flying. In this case, the thing has flying. And all they have to do is have a random artifact token or something out. There's a million ways to do that in Standard. So, again, I don't want to be one of the people that looks at this and is like, it's bad, because this, again, is effectively a 2/2 flyer every turn, even if you remove the 2/2 flyers. And that could get out of hand, right? So, all I'm saying is don't underestimate it. But let's look at what I think might be the best card of the day. Now, there is still one more rare after this, at least. I have to reload the spoiler sites and see if they threw anything else at us. But still, there is at least one more card after this. But that card makes me actively angry. And it is a good card, but it makes me very angry, and I want to talk about it last. The best card of the day is probably Hardlight Containment, a single white mana for an aura that enchants an artifact you control. You got that? It's a 1 mana aura that enchants an artifact you control. When it enters, exile target creature an opponent controls until this aura leaves the battlefield. Enchanted permanent, by the way, has Ward 1. So Sheltered by Ghosts is a pretty good card. This doesn't give your creature or your artifact lifelink or whatever, I guess, like Sheltered does, but it also costs 50% of what Sheltered by Ghost does, and that actually is a huge, huge difference. Back in my day, we had a card called Chained to the Rocks, which basically required that you had a mountain, so it could only really be played in red-white decks. This is probably better than Chain to the Rocks, and Chain to the Rocks was like the closest thing to Swords to Plowshares that we had in a really, really long time, which should tell you something. Now, before Chain to the Rocks, I guess we had Condemned and obviously Path to Exile, so it's not like we hadn't had other and mostly better Swords to Plowshare variants over time. History lesson, kids, but Chain to the Rocks was really, really good in its standard environment. And this is a little bit easier, I think, to enable than a Chain to the Rocks. More decks can play it, at the very least. And again, I think that's a big deal. It's no Leyline Binding the way Leyline Binding is currently played, but I would wager that it's actually easier for a deck to play this than it would be to play Leyline Binding, especially with Get Lost in the format. Like, your opponent might just give you artifacts to use. It seems pretty good, but you could also get lost one of your own guys or something to get the artifacts. You could get lander tokens. You could get map tokens in other ways. And it doesn't even have to be an artifact token. It can be a Maze Mine Tome or anything, really. It could even be a boat. There's several boats that are artifacts in standard right now. But there's a lot of things you could play on turn one, right? And then now you've got this Hard Light Containment, this Chain to the Rocks variant up for the rest of the game, and it only costs a single mana. It also, again, just like Sheltered by Ghosts in the Enchantress deck in standard, right? The blue-white kind of Duskmourn Enchantments Matters deck. Sheltered is particularly good in that deck because it triggers all of your Enchantments Matter, all your eerie effects and stuff. But this also does that for a single white mana. So I don't know, man. I think this has a pretty big future ahead of it. It's not Lay Down Arms, but it might actually be better than Lay Down Arms for a lot of decks. Again, Chain to the Rocks, you have to play red-white for that to work, and you have to have like mountains. They don't have to be basic, but they have to be mountains. Whereas Lay Down Arms kind of almost forces you into mono-white in a lot of ways. It usually does, right? So it's kind of tough to make both of those work, and I think that this is like easier than both of those cards for the most part. And unlike Lay Down Arms, it's not like conditional on the amount of lands you have or whatever, like this. As long as you got an artifact, you can take out whatever you want, buddy, so long as it's a creature, right? So like Sheltered takes out anything you want it to. That's kind of a big deal. Whereas this is creatures only, which I think might nerf it slightly, but it's still well worth playing. This is a crazy removal spell that you'll have plenty of artifacts to put it on. I guess my one complaint is actually that it's too powerful. I like removal spells like this, but I also like playing 4 and 5 drop creatures. And when there's removal this good in the format, it tends to invalidate the idea of playing 4 and 5 drop creatures. So I worry, but all you got to do is bust this somehow, and you'll always pay an extra mana for it. But whatever, you pay 3 mana for your Disenchant to get your awesome guy back, right? But still, I don't know, man. You don't really have to work that much to get your 1 mana unconditional removal spell. And again, that keeps me off my 5 drops. Let me play my 5 drops. But anyway, we do have one more card to look at today. And it's a card that I absolutely hate. This is Beyond the Quiet. 5 mana, 3 and double white for a sorcery. Exile all creatures and spacecraft. Why? So they rotated Farewell a year ago. And I think a lot of us were really happy to see Farewell leave. Do exactly that. We got to say farewell to Farewell. And then Sunfall, right? So we've all hated Sunfall. I don't know about all of us, but a great deal of us, according to my comment section and my own brain, absolutely hate Sunfall. And this is worse, than Sunfall. It doesn't give your opponent a huge creature, and it doesn't punish you so much for overcommitting, right? Like, a sweeper just does that. A sweeper just punishes you for overcommitting. Sunfall hella punishes you for overcommitting. It gives your opponent a 6/6 or something. That's wild. And at least this doesn't do that. I think this is, for the most part, a worse Sunfall. But we didn't want a fixed Sunfall. We just wanted it gone. Now, I'm sure that there were some control players that were like, oh my God, what are we going to do without Sunfall? You play Ultima. It was a trade that I was willing to have because, I don't get my death triggers on all my Aristocrats guys if you play your Ultima, and that sucks, but at least they go to my graveyard and I can get them back. I can cast Raise the Past and it's fine. No, not anymore. Exile all the creatures. I don't even care about Spacecraft. That's the one thing that, depending on what standard looks like, could make it better than Sunfall because there's some Spacecraft walking around. That could be really good. Don't get me wrong. But just exile all the creatures, exile all the creatures, exile every one of them. Like, again with this, we have to deal with this for another however many years. That's just wild to me. And I know that some people are just going to think that I'm like grousing or whatever, but I also know that Trolley problem here. There's probably going to be way more people who wanted Sunfall to rotate out than there are people who wanted some sort of fixed Sunfall variant. So I side with, I think, the masses on this one, or at least that's what my brain's telling me. Most people that I have talked to, even certain control players, cannot stand Sunfall. And this is, a rose by any other name. It's still a rose. And even though this doesn't give the opponent a large creature, it still does the thing that we all hate about Sunfall. Why? Why are you printing this card? You've heard it, right? Like, Wizards, you've heard everyone say, like, oh, I can't wait for Sunfall to rotate. The card sucks. And you don't have to ban it. It's not like crazy or anything. Don't take that to mean a fixed version would be fine. I don't want a fixed one. I think Commander players may not want a fixed version of Sunfall. Now we have Sunfall, Farewell, and this that exiles all the creatures on a Commander table. Commander people probably don't love that either. It's like, let me keep my guys. Let me use my graveyard as a sort of resource. It's why does it exile everything? Why is that? It's not even good design. Like, why did you feel the need? Why did you feel the need to print that? I don't understand why the card even exists. Like, everyone hates. I shouldn't use the word everyone, but like most of the people I talk to about the existence of Sunfall and Farewell, like, hate these cards from Standard all the way to Commander. So just like, why are you doing it? Well, I want an explanation. Somebody, Gavin, get in the comments. What are you doing? I just don't get it. This is my breaking point. And they're going to print like 3 more of these in the next couple of years. There's going to be like at least a couple more of these in different sets, especially when we hit next year's rotation. There's going to, this set has to have a variant. No, it doesn't. Stop it. Stop it. Just let me know. Am I stupid? Like, let me know. Am I being crazy down there in the comments? I saved a good 10% of this video's runtime for yapping about how much I hate this card. So let me know down there in the comment section if I'm correct. It turns out, though, there were some good cards today. This is one of them. This is a good Magic card. That's the problem. That's the issue. That's also kind of my issue with that 1 white mana removal spell. Is like, boy, we're getting some answers today, aren't we? It sucks to see the first week of preview season is like, oh, look at this guy I can play. Look at this guy I can play. And then the second week we start Monday by being like, you can't play those guys. It's just, I don't know how I feel about that. But again, there were very powerful cards today. If you wanted this to be a powerful set, you're getting it. At the very least, I'm glad we have Servandum. Servandum, once it gets to 4 power, you can cast this thing all you want. You can cast the new Chain to the Rocks thing all you want. You can exile my guy. I don't care. I still get to blow up one of your things. This seems pretty all right. So I guess if we're going to see more effects like this stupid thing over here, I want to see more effects like that, where a creature will still do a thing if he's exiled. Maybe we can start, correcting for it in the other direction. But you could always just not print stuff like this if you wanted to solve the problem. I think that would be better. But anyway, that's the spoilers for today, ladies and gentlemen. I have in the interim, during my hate screed, I have reloaded the spoiler sites, and I didn't see nothing new. So join me again tomorrow for a bunch of new cards. Hopefully there's going to be a bunch of hype stuff then too. But it looks like this spoiler season's ending on either Thursday or Friday, considering moving stream to Friday. But one way or the other, the next time we get on twitch.tv/spmtgdev, it's on your screen right now. Take that thing's word for it, not my own, because I don't know how to speak English good. Next time we get on Twitch and stream, we're probably going to be doing all the cards. We're going to be rating every single card in the set in a speed run, which I know you guys always like to see me put myself through. And then even though at the end of it, I've lost my voice entirely and I can't recover for the next 3 days, and it takes a lot out of me spiritually, it still has the worst like to dislike ratio once I get it on YouTube. You guys hate my rating system so much. But anyway, go on over to Twitch and follow, or use your Prime sub if you want to check that content out when we do it later on this week. But there's plenty of spoilers to look at before it's all said and done. Make sure you sub to the channel for that content. Hit the like button on your way out, and check out the Patreon. I'm pretty sure that's how you say it. Patreon. Check out the Patreon. That's also on screen right now. You can do that. Give me $1 a month. You can vote on what decks we do once we get to the standard season, which is just a week or so away. So get in there, baby. I love you guys. I'm Deb from The Place, and that is Allski Kowalski. Thanks for watching, Wizards. Spread love and be kind.